In the autumn of 1862, along the fertile banks of the Mississippi River near Natchez, a woman named Sarah committed an act so calculated and devastating that it would echo through generations as both horror and testimony. On the night of the annual harvest ball at Thornhill Plantation, 10 white masters fell dead within hours, poisoned by the very hands that had served them for years. This is not a tale of righteous vengeance, though some might wish to frame it so. This is a story about what slavery made of human souls, about the machinery of brutality that ground people into instruments of their own destruction, and about the terrible mathematics of desperation when mercy becomes myth. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, the ones that reveal not heroes or villains, but the complete moral collapse of a society built on human bondage. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, its wealth measured in bales of cotton and the bodies of 247 enslaved people. The mansion itself stood 3 stories high, white columns gleaming in the southern sun, a monument to what its owners called civilization. Colonel Harrison Thornhill, 47 years old, had inherited the estate from his father and expanded it with ruthless efficiency. He was a tall man, lean and angular, educated at the College of William and Mary, a deacon in the Presbyterian Church, and known throughout Adams County as a stern but fair master, which in the lexicon of slavery meant he preferred psychological torment to the whip, though he did not abstain from either. His wife, Catherine Thornhill, 39, came from a prominent Charleston family, a woman of delicate beauty and iron will who managed the domestic enslaved with the precision of a general commanding troops. She believed deeply in the divine order of things, that God had placed white over black, master over slave, and that any deviation from this hierarchy was not merely criminal, but blasphemous. The plantation operated with mechanical efficiency. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon, tended by field hands who rose before dawn and worked until darkness made further labor impossible. The big house employed 22 domestic enslaved, each with specific duties, each monitored by Catherine's sharp eyes and sharper tongue. Among them was Sarah, though that was not the name her mother had given her. She was 31 years old in that autumn of 1862, though she looked both younger and infinitely older, depending on the light. She had been born on Thornhill land, had known no other world than this, and had been trained from childhood in the kitchen, learning the alchemy of Southern cooking from her mother before fever took the older woman. Sarah knew herbs and spices, knew how to coax flavor from the simplest ingredients, knew which roots eased pain and which brought sleep. She was considered valuable property, listed in the estate books at $800, a price that reflected her skills and the cruel calculus of her mixed ancestry, for her father had been white, though no one spoke of this directly. Her skin was the color of aged honey, her eyes an unsettling green, and she moved through the big house like a ghost, present but unseen, a condition slavery demanded of all who served within its walls. The war had changed things, though not in ways the enslaved could openly acknowledge. By 1862, the Confederacy was bleeding, and the Mississippi River had become a contested artery. Union gunboats prowled the waters, and whispers of liberation moved through the slave quarters like wind through cotton. Colonel Thornhill had lost 2 sons to the war, one at Shiloh and another to disease in a Virginia camp. The grief had made him harder, more volatile, more likely to see conspiracy in every glance, rebellion in every hesitation. Catherine had retreated into a rigid piety, spending hours in prayer, hosting sewing circles, where plantation wives made uniforms for soldiers and spoke of the righteousness of their cause. The harvest ball, scheduled for October 12th, was meant to be a reassertion of normalcy, a gathering of the county's elite to celebrate the cotton crop and demonstrate that their world remained intact despite the war's intrusions. Sarah had been preparing for the ball for weeks under Catherine's exacting supervision. The menu was elaborate: roasted pork and venison, sweet potato pie, biscuits and gravy, cornbread, collard greens cooked with ham hocks, peach cobbler, and punch made from imported rum that had cost a small fortune to acquire through the Union blockade. 10 neighboring plantation owners would attend with their wives, along with the local minister, Reverend Ashford, and Dr. Pemberton, who served as physician to the county's white population. It was to be an evening of music and dancing, of toasts to Southern resilience and the certain victory that everyone claimed was coming, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The enslaved would serve, as they always did, invisible hands offering food and drink, present only as function, never as person. The trigger came 3 days before the ball. A young man named Daniel, 19 years old, strong and defiant, had been caught with abolition literature, papers that had somehow made their way upriver, printed words that spoke of freedom as a right, rather than a gift to be bestowed. Colonel Thornhill ordered him whipped publicly, 50 lashes in the yard before the assembled enslaved population, a demonstration meant to crush any thoughts of resistance. Daniel survived the whipping, barely, but that night he died in the quarters, either from the severity of his wounds or from something else, some internal breaking that the body could not sustain. He was Sarah's nephew, her sister's only child. She had watched the whipping with the same blank expression all the enslaved learned to wear, but something in her had calcified into a purpose as cold and sharp as winter steel. She did not weep, she did not rage. She simply began to plan with the methodical precision she brought to every meal she prepared. Pause for a moment and consider what it means to be rendered so powerless that death becomes the only language you can speak, the only act of agency remaining in a world that has stolen everything else, including the right to grieve openly for your own blood. Sarah knew plants. She knew which grew in the woods beyond the cotton fields, which roots and leaves the old people spoke of in whispers, knowledge passed down from Africa and mixed with what this land offered. She knew belladonna grew wild in the shadowed places, its berries like dark jewels. She knew water hemlock, white snakeroot, and oleander that grew in Catherine's own garden, beautiful and deadly. She knew that if you knew how to extract and concentrate, how to mask bitter flavors with sweet, how to calculate dosage for maximum effect without immediate detection, you could turn a feast into a funeral. She gathered her ingredients carefully, over 2 days, moving through the woods in the early morning hours when mist still clung to the ground, taking only what she needed, leaving no obvious trace. She prepared her tinctures in the kitchen late at night, when the big house slept, working by candlelight, her hands steady. This was not rage, exactly. It was something colder, more deliberate. It was the decision that if she could not save Daniel, if she could not save herself or any of them, she could at least make their oppressors understand that slaves were not things, not tools, but human beings capable of consequence. She did not confide in anyone. This was crucial. The slave quarters at Thornhill, like everywhere in the South, existed under constant surveillance, physical and psychological. Trust was a luxury, and betrayal, whether intentional or coerced, was always possible. Sarah worked alone, carried her terrible knowledge alone, because to involve others would mean their deaths as well, and she had already decided that if there was to be punishment, it would fall on her alone. She was aware, in some deep and irrevocable way, that she was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, that she was choosing death but determining its terms, its meaning, its witness. The day of the ball arrived with perfect autumn weather, the sky a deep blue, the air crisp with the scent of turning leaves and distant wood smoke. The enslaved had been working since before dawn, cleaning, cooking, arranging flowers, setting tables with the fine china that Catherine had brought from Charleston. The ballroom gleamed with lamplight, candles reflected in polished mirrors, the chandelier imported from France, casting prismatic light across the floor that had been waxed to a mirror shine. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon, carriages rolling up the long drive, white families in their finest clothes, the men in dark suits, the women in silk gowns that represented months of labor by enslaved seamstresses. There was music, a small ensemble of enslaved musicians playing violins, and a piano, melodies that floated out across the grounds, where the field hands, not permitted inside, listened from the darkness. Sarah moved through the kitchen and the ballroom with her usual efficiency, her face a mask of servile competence. She served the punch herself, ladling it from the crystal bowl, offering cups to the guests with lowered eyes and soft words of hospitality that had been trained into her since childhood. The poison was in the punch, carefully measured, enough to kill but dispersed so that it would take hours to manifest, so that she could be far from the big house when the symptoms began. She had calculated everything, including her own escape, though she knew escape was likely impossible. She had not chosen death out of suicidal despair, but out of a grim logic. Better to die having struck back than to live another decade in submission, better to be remembered, even as monster, than to be forgotten entirely. The ball proceeded with the false gaiety that characterized Southern aristocracy during the war years, a determined performance of normalcy. Colonel Thornhill toasted the Confederacy and predicted victory by spring. The neighboring planters discussed cotton prices, labor management, the unreliability of slaves in wartime, the need for increased vigilance. Their wives spoke of charity work, of soldiers' relief, of maintaining proper Christian homes. Reverend Ashford blessed the gathering and spoke of divine favor resting upon the righteous. They ate and drank, consumed the fruits of enslaved labor, as they had always done, never imagining that the hands that served them had decided to become hands of judgment. If you are watching this and wondering about the moral complexity of such an act, if you want to subscribe to this channel to continue receiving accounts that force us to confront the darkest corners of American history, you are beginning to understand that slavery created conditions where traditional morality collapsed entirely, where the enslaved were given no peaceful means of resistance and then condemned for choosing violent ones. Sarah left the big house around 9 in the evening, as was permitted after the main meal was served and only refreshments remained. She walked back to the quarters, a small cabin she shared with 2 other women, and she waited. She did not sleep. She sat in darkness and listened to the distant music, the laughter that carried across the grounds, and she thought about Daniel, about her mother, about every person she had known who had died under slavery's weight, worked to death, or beaten, or sold away, or simply broken by the relentless grinding of a system that treated human beings as agricultural equipment. She thought about the masters who would be dying soon, and she felt nothing resembling satisfaction, only a hollow awareness that she had done the only thing she could do, the only thing that would make them remember, even briefly, that slaves were not property, but people capable of consequence. The first death occurred around midnight. Mrs. Caldwell, wife of a plantation owner from Wilkinson County, collapsed in the ballroom, vomiting blood. Within minutes, 3 others showed similar symptoms: severe abdominal pain, convulsions, dilated pupils, difficulty breathing. Pemberton, himself beginning to feel unwell, attempted treatment, but he had no antidote, no understanding of what poison he was confronting. By 1 in the morning, 6 were dead. By dawn, the count reached 10. 8 plantation owners, the Reverend, and Dr. Pemberton himself. Colonel Thornhill survived only because he had drunk little punch, preferring whiskey, and Catherine survived because she never drank alcohol, considering it unladylike. The survivors were devastated, terrified, convinced initially of cholera or some other epidemic, but the localized nature of the deaths, all among those who had drunk the punch, soon led to darker suspicions. Investigation came swiftly and brutally. The sheriff arrived by morning with a contingent of armed men, and the interrogations began. Every enslaved person in the big house was questioned, beaten, threatened. Some knew nothing, others suspected but said nothing, understanding that silence was their only protection. Sarah did not wait to be discovered. At dawn, before the authorities came, she walked to the big house, entered through the kitchen she had commanded for years, and found Colonel Thornhill in his study, Catherine beside him, both of them exhausted and grief-stricken, and beginning to understand what had happened. Sarah told them. She spoke clearly, without apology, explaining exactly what she had done and why. She did not ask for mercy because she expected none. She said only that Daniel had been her sister's son, that the 10 dead had represented the system that had killed Daniel, and countless others, and that she had made them understand, finally, that enslaved people were not things, but human beings who could kill just as masters could. The trial, if it can be called that, lasted less than a day. There was no question of guilt. Sarah had confessed. The only question was execution method, and the white community, horrified and terrified by what had occurred, demanded that her death be exemplary. On October 18, 1862, 6 days after the ball, Sarah was hanged in the town square in Natchez, before a crowd of hundreds. Contemporary accounts describe her as composed, silent, refusing to speak or to show fear. Some newspapers called her a monster, evidence of the inherent savagery of the African race, justification for the harshness of slave discipline. Others, a very few, published by abolitionists in the North, called her a martyr, a woman driven to extremity by a system of absolute oppression. The truth, as always, was more complex and more human than either narrative allowed. Pause again and reflect. In a society where enslaved people had no legal recourse, no right to defend themselves or their families, no protection against any abuse however severe, what moral framework can we use to judge Sarah's actions? How do we weigh 10 lives against 200 years of systematic brutality? These questions have no comfortable answers, which is precisely why we must ask them. The aftermath was extensive and telling. Thornhill Plantation never recovered its former prosperity. Colonel Thornhill became obsessed with security, installing locks on every door, requiring poison tests for all food, living in constant fear of another attack. Catherine descended into a religious mania, convinced that Sarah's act had been divine punishment for some unnamed sin, though she never questioned slavery itself. The plantation's enslaved population was sold off over the following 2 years, dispersed to other estates, families separated, the community that had existed there dissolved. The county implemented stricter slave codes, more brutal punishments for any hint of resistance, more restrictions on movement and assembly. The harvest ball was never held again. The 10 families who lost patriarchs struggled. Some estates failed entirely, others barely survived. The war would end slavery 3 years later, but for those directly touched by what happened at Thornhill, the trauma never fully healed. Sarah left no written record, no testament in her own words. We know her story only through the hostile accounts of those who condemned her, through trial documents and newspaper reports that framed her as monster rather than human being driven past endurance. We do not know if she regretted her actions, if she felt guilt or satisfaction, or simply the numbness that slavery cultivated in those who endured it. We know only that she chose to act, to transform herself from victim into agent, and that her actions exposed, for one terrible night, the violence that underlay the entire system of slavery, the violence that existed every day but was usually hidden beneath the genteel surface of plantation life. The story of Sarah forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about resistance under absolute oppression. History prefers its heroes non-violent, its resistors morally pure, its narratives of liberation clean and uncomplicated. But slavery was not clean or uncomplicated, and the people who survived it, who resisted it, who sometimes struck back against it, were not symbols but complex human beings, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Sarah killed 10 people, and that is a fact that cannot be minimized or excused. But she killed them within a system that had killed thousands, that treated human beings as property, that provided no legal or peaceful means of resistance, that would have killed her slowly over decades of labor and abuse if she had remained compliant. To understand her requires us to understand the complete moral bankruptcy of slavery, the way it corrupted not just the enslaved but the entire society, creating conditions where violence became the only language anyone understood. In the decades after the Civil War, the story of Sarah became a ghost story in Mississippi, told in whispers, transformed into legend. Some versions made her a conjure woman, gifted with dark magic. Others made her insane, driven mad by abuse. Almost none acknowledged her as what she actually was, a skilled, intelligent woman who made a calculated decision to destroy her oppressors, even at the cost of her own life, who chose to be remembered as dangerous rather than forgotten as docile. The Thornhill mansion burned in 1871, cause unknown, and the land was eventually sold off in parcels. Today, nothing remains of the plantation except a historical marker that mentions only that it was a significant cotton-producing estate, with no reference to Sarah, to Daniel, to the Harvest Ball Massacre, or to any of the 247 enslaved people who lived and died there. This erasure is not accidental. It represents the South's determined effort to forget its own history, to replace the reality of slavery with myths of benevolent masters and happy slaves, to sanitize a past so brutal that honest acknowledgement would require a complete moral reckoning. The legacy of Sarah's act extended beyond Thornhill Plantation. Throughout Mississippi and neighboring states, plantation owners increased security measures, restricted enslaved people's access to kitchens and medicine cabinets, implemented poison testing protocols, and generally acknowledged what they had always known, but preferred not to state openly, that slavery created enemies within the household, that every enslaved person was a potential threat, that the entire system rested on violence and surveillance because without these it would collapse. The paranoia that Sarah's actions created reveals the fundamental instability of slavery, the way it poisoned, both literally and figuratively, the society that depended on it. Masters lived in constant fear of the people they claimed to care for paternalistically, and that fear was justified, because slavery was not a relationship of mutual obligation, but a system of exploitation that could only be maintained through terror, and terror, once established, flows in both directions. If we are to learn anything from Sarah's story, it is that slavery destroyed everyone it touched, though not equally. It destroyed the enslaved through violence, deprivation, and dehumanization. It destroyed the enslavers through moral corruption, paranoia, and the cultivation of cruelty. It destroyed families, communities, and the possibility of genuine human connection across racial lines. It created a society so diseased that acts like Sarah's became, if not justifiable, then at least comprehensible, as the logical endpoint of a system based on absolute power and absolute powerlessness. We cannot celebrate her actions without becoming complicit in the cycle of violence, but neither can we condemn her without acknowledging that she was responding to a violence far greater and more sustained than anything she could inflict in a single night. These stories reveal the true cost of slavery, not in abstract terms of economics or politics, but in human terms of souls destroyed, moralities corrupted, and a legacy of trauma that extends across generations. The silence that surrounds stories like Sarah's, the determined forgetting that erased her from official history, represents the South's ongoing refusal to confront what slavery actually was and what it did to everyone involved. We tell these stories not to glorify violence or to provide simplistic moral lessons, but to insist that history be remembered fully, in all its complexity and horror, because only through honest reckoning can we begin to understand the society we inherited and the work still required to address its ongoing consequences. Comment below with your thoughts on how we remember resistance under oppression, how we judge actions taken in contexts of absolute brutality, and what it means that stories like Sarah's were deliberately erased from the historical record. Subscribe to continue this journey through the darkest and most forgotten corners of American history, where the stories reveal truths that comfortable narratives prefer to ignore.